Hi, everybody. Welcome back to We Got Next with Anthony Fava. I'm your host, Anthony Fava, and this is episode 3 of my show where we interview young Canadians in creative industries all over Canada. This week we have a very special guest for our third episode. Just a quick intro for him. He was born in London, Ontario, and he started out in music and visual arts before transitioning more into writing and theater. After brief studies in Stratford, Ontario, and London, England, he decided to fully devote himself to the arts. And since then, he has released multiple poetic works, including his debut collection of poetry, The Correct Fury of Your Why is a Mountain, which poetic critic Jim Johnson described as among the most promising poetic projects to come out of Canada in recent years. Today, he continues writing poetry and is also the founder and president of Astoria Pictures, whose debut film, Movements, has won multiple festival awards. Please welcome to the show the multi-talented Kevin Andrew Heslop.
That sounds great. Fantastic. Oh, that's. I should make one amendment, which was actually I could make several, but one of them would be that although he is a poetic critic, it was poet critic Jim Johnstone, who said those kind things about my debut, as he said so many kind things about so many poetic or poetry debuts of Canadian poets from coast to coast. My love and gratitude to Jim. Thanks for having me, Anthony. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, well, thank you again for coming on. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation about your life, your poetry, your other art forms you've explored, and just like some tips you have for those that might be listening at home or watching or wherever they're watching or listening from. Just some tips for them to further their own careers too.
I have to say, I'm a little suspicious of the idea of career. Not sure what it means. I think in the arts, it's something that one must be suspicious of, this idea of career, professionality, even. I'm thinking about Philip Seymour Hoffman, who at one point, like coming into his own in his 20s in theater, was asked by a more senior member of the theater, well, what are you going to do next? He's like, I don't know. I'll get a job, on do a play or something. He's like, no, never call it a job. And so, yeah, I don't know about this career business, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you put at me in as cunning and oblique a fashion as you will already have observed my responses in response to your questions so far.
Oh, no worries at all. So actually, I just wanted to start off with a bit of your background and your childhood and upbringing and just kind of your first introduction into the arts in general. I know you kind of started off, as I said, with music and visual arts more so before getting into writing and theater. So I just kind of want to hear about your upbringing more so with the arts.
Um, well, as that bio mentioned, um, I think my first kind of intentional engagement with the arts was through music. I started playing the drums when I was in the seventh grade, so I would have been 11 or 12. I think because I thought it was cool, um, uh, and found I had some kind of aptitude for it, and started playing with friends of mine, Phil Spina and Connor Brennan. And then Max Holden joined, played in a band throughout high school. I was also playing percussion in a variety of different bands, going to school, jazz band, concert band, percussion ensemble, that sort of thing. Um, and I was studying visual art, like visual art history, in high school as well. Um, and I think I was, yeah, just always drawn to whatever the arts are. Those are always an appealing way to be. Um, I did a play when I was in the eighth grade as well. If I start to cast my mind back before high school, um, and before then, I think I was always like absorbing films and music and reproducing them in one way or another, musically or theatrically or otherwise. And started writing towards the end of high school. I've been writing for, I guess, 12 or 14 years. now. And where does that leave us? How am I doing in response to questions? I have tough time with questions
Oh
sometimes. I'm
no,
not
no,
sure where they
you're
begin
doing
or where
really
they end.
good. I was also wondering though, because you grew up in London. That's where I went to university and spent like 5 years of my life. And I think not a lot of people really see that London, Ontario, they wouldn't expect it anyways, to have sort of an arts culture that it does. Though there, especially with theater, I would say with the Grand Theater and then all the theater they have going on at TAP, Center for Creativity, as well as at Fanshawe and Western. Did you notice that at all growing up, or did it kind of evolve as you lived in London?
Well, yeah, that's something I hadn't mentioned since we started speaking, is that it's our mutual friend Jack Copeland, who I met through the theater scene at Western, that allowed us to be connected. So grateful to Jack for the chance to speak with you. So I try not to be too meddlesome, but I am suspicious about this term London to refer to the place that you matriculated and where I grew up. It's like a bizarre place. As I explain it to others as I've been traveling for the last few months, I'm from London. They say, "Oh, London, you're from," and then they say, "Well, it's so London, Ontario. It's called London, Ontario. It's in Canada." They say, "Oh, London, Canada. How does?" I say, "Okay, so the way that Canada was colonized, they have like a Paris, Ontario, and they chuckle, and they also have like a Stratford, Ontario, which is where the Shakespeare Festival happens. They're like, there's a Stratford, and okay, and then I'm like, and there's a London, Ontario. There's like a Covent Garden Market that we have in this place called London, Ontario, and also a Thames River. Um, it seems like a really weird kind of palimpsestic, I don't know, Anglo-centric, weirdly, yeah. Anyway, whatever that place is, I'm from there, uh, and the theater. So, all right, I have to try to contain my answers into like sentences rather than something more sprawling than sentences. So I got involved in the theater scene at Western in maybe my second year of university with the interest really of just being able to better inform my ability to deliver poetry to audiences. I'd been reading poetry that I'd been writing at open mics and workshopping it, and at a certain point, I realized that I wanted to be better able to sort of present to an audience, and so that's how I got into it. And shortly after starting, I really started to love it. Sort of suspension of time that it can afford, and exploration of something other than one's own consciousness. I'm not sure if that's totally true, but sticking to the sentence here. Um, uh, I'm not sure how, like, from a global perspective, to the extent that I have access to one, vibrant the theater scene is in London, Ontario. I mean, it was offered at Western, although not curricularly, which is to say that like the performance of theater wasn't on syllabi, but rather critically responding to theater and studying the history of theater and writing essays in response to plays and that sort of thing is a component of the theater program at Western. I know that there are other universities in Ontario, Guelph, for instance, which has a like an acting undergrad where one is able to kind of perform and embody text rather than just critique it. Um, yeah, I'm not sure how long the Grand Theater has been around, but it's obviously a place of some dynamic activity in London, and um, there have been, I think, coming and going a few different sort of independent theater companies in London. My sense is that the theater scene was a little more vibrant in the 80s and 90s, and then it's like quietened a bit since then. But I haven't been back for a little while. I'm aware of a couple of companies in town, but yeah. So here are the kinds of sprawling hedges of responses that you're going to, I hope, get used to over the next half an hour or so. Uh, After you.
Yeah, well, one thing you kind of did mention there was during your theater time, you almost used it as a way to further your, I guess, poetic mind a bit. So I kind of wanted to know a bit about how your poetry has developed from like those early days when you first started writing, maybe before university, that sort of thing, to how it is now, and maybe even how the other art forms have influenced it over time.
Nice question. I appreciate that. So, how to offer a question or an answer that's equal to the question? This is always the challenge. This is why I prefer to be in your seat as the interviewer, because it's much easier to offer an interesting question sometimes than it is to offer an interesting answer. Nevertheless, I'll attempt it. Okay, so the sort of development of my writing. Um, I mean, the first poems that I wrote, and I'm not sure why I wrote them, but I just felt compelled to write them, were kind of what you might think of as more kind of conventional poems. They were very metrically aware. That is, they were very aware of their rhythm. They were end rhymed, which is to say that they had rhymes at ends in couplets or sometimes in sort of alternating patterns in quatrains. And they were a bit sing-songy, and that's just what came out for whatever reason. And then, a writer like any artist, again, I'm suspicious a little bit of nouns, but a writer like any artist undergoes periods of influence where more than being influenced, you're, I think, effectively replicating the sounds of or the shapes of whatever you seem to be attracted to for whatever reason. And so um, after those first beginnings, I think, yeah, like pretty much anybody else, underwent periods of being like deeply influenced by and responding to the works of writers that I really admired. I was like crazy about Bukowski at one point and making like bad imitations of Bukowski. Hunter S. Thompson was really big for me. His letters, particularly, there was like uh, there was an energy to his letters that was really interesting to me. Hemingway, Cormac McCarthy, like the old white guys, were largely influential to me in like my late teens and early 20s. And then my reading started to diversify from there. Um, and I found that I was interested not only in individual writers, but in maybe more broad in writing generally, if I can put it like that. The forms that poetry affords, for instance. And yes, as I said, I've been writing for maybe 10 or 12 years. And the work that I've been doing lately, if I can call it work, again, suspicious of work, suspicious of career, suspicious of job, it feels like very easy and natural and enjoyable and exploratory to be sitting now with stacks of books that I encounter as I travel, kind of ransacking libraries, and allowing sort of books to fall open as they will, and then kind of pulling bits and pieces, and then moving to the next text and pulling bits and pieces, phrase here, word there, phrase there, and eventually a poem starts to form, sort of footnoted throughout, providing the sources for each of those lines. Um, and it's a relatively unusual process, but it's what I'm activated by or fixated on right now. And it also allows me an opportunity to engage with texts that I might not otherwise engage with, especially if you're in the company of a library at an artist residency, as I have been for the past few months at different residencies. Um, Given the unusualness of the surrounds, you're more inclined to go out and explore or to work on whatever it is you're working on. But this practice allows me to engage with a whole bunch of texts a little bit at a time and then create these kind of collages absorbed by local libraries. So um, I guess that would give you a sense of the trajectory from like a conventional metrically minded rhyming structure to what I hope is, or what my intention is to be less egocentric, like for it to be less text that I feel like I'm generating and more text that I'm kind of facilitating almost as like a detached sort of third person observer, rather than like the author proper. Again, author being something that I'm a little suspicious of generally. There are no ivory towers from which works of genius spring. But anyway, yeah, I'm getting a little off track. It's helpful if you corral me every once in a while. Please do feel like you can intrude. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you mentioned a couple names there, and I was just wondering if there was one inspiration that really sticks out as something that a young poet or someone really looking to up their poetry game, someone that they could really look to, whether it's a Hunter S. Thompson or something like that?
So the first name that came to mind, just to be transparent with you, was Robert Hass, Hass. Um, he writes, according to critic, um, his writing is like a body of water whose temperature is not much different from the temperature of the surrounding air, such that when you enter it, you're not even aware that you're entering another medium until you feel the tug of the undertow. Nicely put by a critic, but at any rate, I think Haas is interested by the rhythms of sentences in novels, and that comes across in the sort of blank verse. I won't get into what the is, but blank pauses. He also is very good with fragments, very short bits. I'm thinking of one. I hope I'll be able to recount it. Well, he says, for instance, all it is sunlight on granite. He says elsewhere, um, the old art historian, I was going on about Cézanne, and he brought me to the studio and he took down 4 tubes of shades of green and he said, okay, now listen, put these in small rectangular daubs on the canvas until they shimmer. And until you can do that, I say this in all friendship, shut up about Cézanne. Um, the apple trees of Olema, the apple trees at Olema is a fine collection of his. Also, most recently, Summer Snow. But like I said, that's just the first text that came to mind. Hass is a significant influence in my work over the last few years. I'm also thinking about something that Dylan Thomas said in response to that question, essentially, which is, read whatever kind of curls your hair or, sets you on fire. If you're not having that response to text, then stop reading it. In the context of our conversation having to do with your uh, studies at school, I appreciate that's maybe not ideal counsel for a student who might be expected to follow through on reading lists and syllabi and that sort of thing. But at least call it recreational reading or reading for pleasure. If it's not interesting to you, then just put it down and go on to something else because there's so much good that's out there, and you just need to find what's good for you. There's nothing that's universally good for everyone, and I think increasingly we're as a kind of as a I don't want to say as a species, that's too grand, but and I can't say as a culture because where does one culture end and another begin these days? But I think collectively we're starting to recognize that the idea of a canon, this is the good stuff, is very suspicious because those who are pointing at individual texts have a vested interest in those texts, and so I guess part of my response to that would be suspicious of anyone who says that this is what you should be reading. Um, I think I've heard Noam Chomsky talk in similar terms. And if you're not that interested in poetry and more interested in history, I definitely encourage you to look towards Chomsky's body of work if you can stomach it. Okay, one more suggestion of poetry. Like go with short forms. Something that was really informative for me was reading haiku in translation or hoku in transliteration from the Japanese into English. And again, Robert Hass is a very fine translator of that. I won't go on too long about this, but I'll just offer one haiku transliterated by Robert Hass, transliterated just meaning translated from one language into another, or across alphabets, actually, mean letters. So there's a convention in the haiku form to include a word which denotes a season. And so Isa, a great Japanese poet, writes, writing shit about new snow for the rich is not art. Suspicious of the flatterers of the court, which reminds me of, being suspicious of canons or those who have a vested interest in suggesting authoritative texts. None exist. They're all equally fictional and sacred. Okay, that's enough of me.
So yeah, one thing I was really getting out of that, and one thing you kept saying there was like, no one inspiration is gonna be the same for everyone. It's really about who you find inspiration from. And I guess with that, you obviously had to get works published early on, and I was just wondering how you balanced still using your voice, your style, like what you wanted to write, with still trying to get that work published and maybe having to like, I don't know if you had to adhere to maybe what publishers wanted, things like that, but just how to keep your voice alive more so. I was wondering how you went about doing that.
Um, so a poem comes to mind. I think I could probably recite it, but I'm just going to check the text first, and this will serve as a preface to my response to your question here. I just have to recall the title of it. Poet's name is Mark Strand, who's another poet actually that I would heartily recommend. Appreciating again that we're talking about dead whites. Um, I'll refrain tokenistically from including other voices in my recommendations at the moment, in reflection on that comment. Okay, Mark Strand. Uh, in a field, I am the absence of field. This is always the case. Wherever I am what is missing. When I walk, I part the air, and always the air moves in to fill the spaces where my body's been. We all have reasons for moving. I move to keep things whole. Mark Strand, keeping things whole. That poem is, and the reason that that poem came to mind is because I remember him in an interview having mentioned the circumstances of his having written that. He was sitting down with another poet, and they were playing, I think, cribbage. And he said to the other poet who would understand, "Excuse me, I've just got to write something down." Went to the kitchen, wrote that down verbatim, and then came back and continued the card game. Wrote it within a minute or two. And on this question of voice, it seems to me that uh, that too much meditation on what one's own voice is supposed to consist of actually gets in the way of producing it. Uh, there's like a performance anxiety that can come about by focusing on your own voice. I'm thinking of this in theatrical terms too. Like if you want to ensure that the people in the back of the auditorium or the theater hear you, if you're like focused on your own voice, you won't be able to communicate to them. But if you're focused on the back of the room, and if you can like envision the shape of their ear in the back, then and you aim for that, then you'll arrive there. So then your voice will arrive there. So I would say don't worry about what your voice is or the importance of it being original. When you get out of the way and when you don't focus on yourself, but rather on whatever it is that captivates your interest, or allow that inspiration just to come through as it wants to, then what you do will be interesting. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to refrain from a diatribe about the English language and the presumptions of possession or ownership that are implicit to it, which I think are leading to a lot of the, if we call them challenges that are circulating around the world at the moment. But one of them is this idea of like your voice, that it's mine. It's like that I have some kind of ownership over it. I'm not sure if like the river is so self-consciously aware of every drop of water that passes through its mouth as being its, you know. Likewise, the air that moves through us is just moving through us and it's not ours per se. Um, we're like, yeah, temporary phenomenon. I think I saw it in a Murakami text that I was reading earlier. That's another writer I'd recommend is Murakami. Anyway, focusing on one's own voice, I wouldn't worry about it. I would say if you're writing and you're inspired by other writers, which might be an indication that you're meant to be a writer, focus on that writing and what it is about that writing that captivates you, and then replicate it. Like a lot of one's evolution is just about mimicry. Not to presume that I'm in some state of higher evolution or something, but like one's growth is mimicry early on, I think. And if you're worried about your own voice, it's possible that you won't produce it. Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. And I guess from there, with your voice, you do have quite a few things published, as I said, and one of those is The Correct Theory of Your Why is a Mountain, your first full collection of your works. I just want to know what it was like getting that published specifically. Like, it seems like that must have been like a huge moment for you as a poet.
Um, again, I won't just invoke this to be. I think there's some value in including that. The extent to which I feel like that's my collection is not great. Um, and one of the ways that I would communicate that through that book was by means of an acknowledgement section, which included certainly the names of over 100 poets that I'd encountered in the original English or translated into English and usually like a modern English over the course of my joyful development as a poet, and all of those influences have contributed to whatever it is that my voice seems to be. So in that sense, I don't feel like ownership or possession over that book, but it has my name on it, and there's I don't know. It seems like it has a certain solidity to it. So I won't duck your question, but just that as like a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, first book. mm, I mean, I think there's a lag to publication, right? So um, you submit something to a journal, and maybe it'll take 8 months before you hear back. And if you submit a manuscript to a publisher, it might be 8 months before you hear back. And at that point, they will say, okay, so here's the manuscript, and we're thinking about we'll publish it in 2.5 years. And then when the thing comes out, it's like this feels like the artifact of someone I no longer am. You know what I mean? Um, that said, uh, and that's just consistently been my experience with work that comes into the world is like the person you are when the work comes into the world is different from the person you were when you created it. And um, uh, and yet, in my case, fortunately, the original manuscript that I had submitted, which again was the like an accumulation of what I'd written, the kind of say cream that had risen to the top of whatever I had written over the preceding decade, as evaluated by myself and my editor Shane Nielsen. That original manuscript, I was able to kind of continue to update and improve over the course of the next year and a half, 2 years before the thing was actually published. And so I was in the unusual and fortunate position of being able to include into the book that was ultimately published work that had been written like 6 months before it actually achieved print, so to speak. So in that sense, it felt even more like my voice in the moment that the book came out. But nevertheless, there is that lag, and that's a significant factor in publication to consider. Um, like I've just put out these films, which again don't feel like mine. It's very much a collaborative effort, but they are expressions of preoccupations that I provided hospitality to, beginning sort of 5 years ago. Uh, and so to someone who has yet to, and I trust that you will, in whatever form it takes, put work into the world. When it appears in the world, one could imagine that there's like I want to say concomitant, but I I get carried away by multiple syllable words needlessly sometimes. That there's an accompanying sense of pride at the emergence of that piece of work into the world. Um, and there is, sure, you feel good and you like to be at the table of the other people who have their books. Like I went to this literary festival when the book, or actually when a chapbook that preceded that full length collection came out. And I was just among all of these poets who had books out and they were reading to each other. And I was like, this is fantastic. Like, this is the group that I want to be a part of. And I have that experience in a variety of different artistic disciplines, but that was one of those significant experiences for me was this chapbook, which was called There Is No Minor Violence, just as there is no negligible cough during an aria, which came out in 2019. Uh, so it's nice to feel included in that group. And to explore other people's work and to partake in the sort of tradition of nobody buying anybody's books, but like just trading books. And then you just have a bunch of books at the end of it. which is hilarious from any kind of commercial or economic perspective, but nourishing in maybe a more spiritual way. So there's that pride that comes with that, but then there's also that sense of lag and like uh, this has a bit of a warp in it compared to where I am now, or maybe I have a warp in relation to this thing, which is like clean cut and concrete in the world. So yeah, there's my troubling response.
Yeah, and near the end of that, you were kind of touching on, when the book came out and everything, getting to feel like amongst those other poets and like people that you may have even looked up to, or been inspired by. So I was kind of wondering with that one phrase that comes up a lot, especially when you're getting into an industry, is imposter syndrome. And I was just wondering if you ever
Mm,
felt that at any point, and also just how you specifically dealt with that, if you did.
great. Yeah, so I see this phrase a lot. Um, imposter syndrome. I mean, the annoying part of me, like, the uh, the etymology of syndrome. So from the Greek syndrome, I'm probably mispronouncing that. From sun meaning together and dramain to run. So running together, a group of symptoms which consistently co-occur, a condition characterized by a set of associated symptoms. So imposter, the associated symptoms related to being an imposter. I jokingly mentioned to a friend of mine, dear friend, uh, entity, we'll call her, um, that when I was like 5 years old, I was at the public school, University Heights, that I went to in a place called London, Ontario. And I like evaded the classroom and I tottered into the auditorium and the curtains were drawn. I walked up on stage and then I like peeked through the curtains and noticed that there weren't all of the chairs and people coughing with their programs in hand, awaiting my performance. And I was like, why haven't people assembled? I have everything to offer them right now. I want to perform for them. Um, and so it was as if I had like misapprehended what time in my life I was in at that moment. So that's to say, like, imposter syndrome requires one's focus on where one is in the present moment, as opposed to like a sense of one's trajectory or maybe a sense of a coming horizon towards which one is bound. And so I think like decentering whoever it is you feel you are in the present moment and recognizing that you're in a process which has a trajectory um, is an important consideration. Um, I'm not much of a sports, well, not much of an any kind of person, but the analogy that's coming to mind is like when a ball is coming off a bat at like 140 kilometers an hour or however fast balls come off of bats and is on its way into the air, there are things that you can infer based on its speed and its angle that relate to where that ball will end up. But you have to recognize it's on its way. It's on its way. And so if you were to say that a home run was impossible because the ball was only 2.5 feet off the bat, you're mistaking that there's a velocity involved in that. And if you're desirous of some kind of home run, and that's another conversation, then just keep in mind that you're part of a process here and that you're on a trajectory and you don't know where you're going to end up necessarily, but some of the ingredients which are necessary to get you there are already in you and others you have yet to encounter, and just be in the process. That's one thing. The other thing is you're completely, fully, all the time, every iota of you worthy of all that you receive. And um, if you feel less than or unworthy, um, that's a valid way to feel. And when you feel that way. But also recognize that can be informed by the ways in which we're socialized in a society which doesn't distribute worthiness equally. So recognizing that we're like these porous beings which absorb our environments, consider for a moment why it is that that feeling of unworthiness uh, consists in you or subsists in you. it's possible that there are like environmental factors at play which do not speak at all to the fundamental worthiness that you at your core possess. Okay, possess isn't the right verb to use, but um, which you are suffused with. Um, and and I say this from an informed position to an extent, which is, I'm I'm coming to the end of 3 months traveling. It's obscene. It's obscene. I wake up, it's obscene. I go to sleep, it's obscene. It's like the most incredible cosmic alignment of luck and opportunity and invitation to presence that I feel I have yet encountered. Although I'm also the kind of person who just ecstatically feels that the movie that he just saw was the best movie that was ever made. And oh my God, and you can feel the same way about the next movie that you saw the following week. Nevertheless, this has been like an extremely lucky and um, yeah, kismet experience that I've been in the midst of for the last few months. And just to give you a sense of it, there was like a 1 month long art residency at a place called the Belgrade Art Studio in Belgrade, Serbia in May. And then in June, a month at a place called the Artilis Center for Creativity in just outside of Tampere, actually outside of Haminkiiro, Finland. And then another week in Finland. And then time in Denmark with relatives of mine. And now, after a few days in Nice with a friend of mine, like 2 weeks in this place, this gorgeous, I mean, before our interview, I was just sitting in the midst of literally 1,000-year-old church in the silence. And it's just obscene. It's so lucky. And I think one of the ways that I've responded to the sense that I don't deserve this experience is by like unusual, for me, unusual levels of productivity and feeling like I really need to churn the work out in order to deserve this experience. And maybe wiser of my friends have counseled me that I do deserve this experience. I have a tough time accepting that possibility. But again, I know in my hearts that we are all worthy of all abundance, all conceivable abundance. And so yeah, so this is something that I struggle with to that extent too. At the same time, like I have some sense of partaking of some kind of destiny or something like that, and that relationship with some kind of destiny requires things of me which have to do with like meditation and sobriety and exercise. um, mm, yeah, one last sort of counsel, just because I seem to be full of it at the moment, would be try meditation. And I won't say anything more than that.
Okay, okay. And you kind of touched on the traveling and how it's been influencing your work. And I was just wondering, to how much of an extent has like traveling around the world, as I said, influenced your work? Like, are there any specific areas, whether it's poetry or other art forms, that have specifically been influenced through your travels?
Um, I just want to say thank you for doing the work that you're doing and asking these questions. Like I tend to be the one on your side of the desk, so to speak, asking questions of people. And one of the reasons that I like to interview people is because I think providing like attentive listening is one of the kind of genuine gifts that we can offer in the world. And so I'm just grateful for your offering that. And I'll respond to your question. Um, I mean, I was joking with a friend the other day that like I've routinely eaten cutlery, or rather, I haven't eaten cutlery. Um, I have routinely eaten meals using, with aid of, cutlery, which is older than the country that I am from purports to be, um, which is to say that there's a sense of time in Europe that I hadn't experienced in the weird sort of veneer, I almost said venereal, veneer of like colonial culture, the like bizarre kind of tarmac that has been imposed in that country called Canada that I'm from. There's a different relationship to time. And I'm sure that if I had been more mindful of the depth of time and culture which exists in the place called London, Ontario, then I would have had a similar relationship growing up to the depth of time that I experience every day and as a matter of course and casually in Europe. Um, I mean, in Belgrade, for instance, um, you just see like a sunlit assemblage of people drinking cappuccinos and lemonade, like about a fort which is hundreds, if not thousands, of years old and has the fingerprints of multiple competing empires all over it. Um, that depth of time has been really enriching for me. Um, like I was joking too that I had spent a night at an Airbnb in Copenhagen, Denmark, which was 1 year younger than Canada's Confederation. It was like 19 or 1868 or 1869. Anyway, um, so there's that depth of time, and that exists in the place, and that exists in like the objects that one encounters in these places. But then, and this is particularly available for those who get around by means of arts residencies, and I have things to say about arts residencies and the means by which people in your audience might partake of them too, not at their own expense, but rather at the expense of arts. So suspend that thought for a second. Um, you get around at these arts residencies, you encounter artists from all over the world. So when I was in Serbia, I was, working alongside an artist from Australia. And when I was in Finland, I was working alongside artists from the UK and from South Africa and from East Asia and from the States uh, and just encountering people who have whatever disease one has as an artist, um, from different walks of life, and who are also practicing in disciplines which are different from one's own. Like, I met this fantastic uh, gymnast and like circus performer and uh, acrobat called Hannah Guy from Newcastle when I was in Finland, and I mean just that encounter and the opportunity to have conversations with that person alone was like vastly worth the price of admission. It can be just so enriching to encounter um, people um, whose worlds and points of reference are different from one's own, and that also bears on the question of language. I mean, when you travel, you get out of the daily habits, which one just being a mammal in space uh, accumulates, and important, I think, centrally important to whatever it is the artist's job is seeing things for the first time, like to have an experience as if for the first time. It's like the requirement of actors. I mean, um, they have to perform in such a way as to you know make themselves believe and have the audience believe as a result that they're speaking the words for the first time, that they're having that experience for the first time. um, when you're traveling, you actually are. And so, like stupering into a grocery store in Finland and your eyes are just the size of like tea kettles, I want to say, or saucers. And you're just looking around gobsmacked, like, this is how they do a grocery store in Finland. Okay, this is fantastic. And, people brush by you and they've got their carts and their baskets and that sort of thing. They're like, you idiot, out of my way. Of course, they don't say that in Finland because they're very courteous, although reserved, very courteous and polite. Um, but when you're traveling, you constantly have that experience, and that experience is in fact required of you, especially when you're in places where your primary tongue isn't the one that's most widely spoken in the place. Um, you you are required to attend to the present moment because of its newness, if only as a function of self-preservation. Okay, I'm going on and on. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. No, well, my next thing here was actually just speaking of new experiences. There's a lot of people listening that might be trying to get their work noticed more, or even just like seen for the first time. So I was wondering for you, like earlier on in your career and just your artist history, were there ways that you specifically got your work seen before the actual publishing of it per se, like whether it's magazines or mediums like that?
My thoughts on that are a few. So one is like the way I started. to become involved in arts communities was through a reading series in London, Ontario called Poetry London, and concurrent with that, an open mic series called London Open Mic Poetry. And I would go to the reading series, and they had a workshop before the readings took place. And I would sit down for an hour and look at poems that had been written by the featured poets that were coming through and other participant poets in the room. And then we'd sit down and listen to, for 45 minutes or an hour, readings from two poets from somewhere across the country that had books out and were, sort of established, fairly established in their work. And so it's like the inverse of traveling. Rather than going to places, I was having as if they were ordered for my own benefit. In some ways, I suppose they were. People from across the country who were coming to London to read, and so I had this opportunity for interface with them and for conversations after the readings. And so workshopping was a component of sharing one's work. I'd bring a poem and we'd talk about it for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or something around the table. People would offer suggestions and thoughts, like, this third stanza, I thought, yeah, this was interesting. I thought that was actually, can we maybe move that to the second stanza? What would that do to the poem? This sort of thing. You have these conversations, which when you're starting out are really meaningful. And and then I, go and read poems that I'd written at an open mic, as I'd mentioned, the London Open Mic Poetry. And so those were two ways to connect from a literary perspective with the community and to have one's work shared in a way that was reciprocal and not, contingent on publication in a journal or magazine or something like that. So seek an open mic if you can find one in your town. Another thing to do in Canada, say, is to reach out to your local arts council. Most municipalities over the size of, I don't know, maybe 200,000 people or something, have this thing called an arts council. This relates to something I mentioned earlier, having to do with residencies and arts councils. They have an arts council whose responsibility it is to administer funds from the city, derived from taxpayers, to artists for particular projects that those artists propose. So you say, I want to write a book about XYZ. And then they say, okay, well, that's sufficient for us to give you whatever, $900 or $1,600 or something like this. So you can take a little bit of time, and you're not dependent on like the 9 to 5 cycle that a career or a job requires of you. And you can produce this thing. Or at least it can offset the cost of your producing it, which is to say the cost of your living. So you can reach out to an arts council, and ask, I'm a musician and I'm looking for community in town. Of course I am, because I'm a musician and, I'm not a soloist, or maybe I am. And can you direct me towards a community? And I expect that there will be people like in London, somebody like Rebecca Morrison Wise, just a wonderful person who supports artists in town in her capacity as an employee with the London Arts Council, and is aware of many of the arts organizations in town to which she might helpfully direct someone who had such a query as that. So look for arts councils, look for open mics. One of the things that I benefited from most when I was at school was, and this is, just the oldest trope in the book, is not encountering the teachers there, but rather encountering classmates, encountering your contemporaries, your colleagues. And so you can start things with them. I mean, you could be like, hey, I'm writing, I see that you're writing, let's start a thing. Sometimes those kinds of workshops are formalized, like creative writing classes, which whatever, they charge $800 for entry or something like this. But it's actually possible to do that stuff outside of the university. And I'd encourage you to do so. Like one of my dear friends and somebody that I've worked with, written in dialogue with, and is called Jenny Burkle. I met her in a creative writing class that was run by Madeline Bassnett at Western. Jenny's a fantastic musician, by the way. If I can offer a plug for anybody, like, let me just offer Jenny Burkle's music's utterly fantastic, sublime. I encourage you to listen to it. Burkle, Berkel, by the way. So yeah, open mic, workshop, arts council, start a thing. And then connected to all of those, particularly the start a thing, is, if you can, if you're able to, if you feel like it, try volunteering. This is a way that I've been able to participate in community, which is just like to contribute to it, to help to facilitate it. Um, like event organizing. Something I did a lot of was like interviewing local artists. Especially, I think for younger artists, this is something to be aware of. Is that artists perhaps more than most uh, Homo sapiens are vastly interested in their own utterances and staring curiously at their own umbilici, gobsmacked that they exist. They're very happy to speak about themselves for half an hour, 45 minutes, or in our case, maybe an hour and a quarter. And so it's also a lovely way for people to maybe shed a little light on a path that has yet to reveal its own light. Or I'm not sure where that metaphor was going, but if you ask artists for interviews, very often they'll say yes. And if you provide them with the courtesy of having familiarized yourself to some extent with their work in advance, then you're setting yourself up for an opportunity with it for an interesting conversation, which is itself like the fundamental act of community is conversation. Um, so yeah, I've spoken enough on that.
Yeah, I guess one thing I just wanted to touch on that you said, you mentioned the interviewing, and obviously, it's kind of deja vu because I'm interviewing you right now, and you're talking about your own interviewing. But I was just wondering, like, how much, like you just said, interviewing other artists has helped you specifically.
Oh yeah, man, totally. Um, yeah, I mean, like these residencies, it like an interview provides an opportunity for a conversation, and there are a couple things that are different about an interview than like any kind of conversation. So, one would be that you're given an implicit permission to go to the same depth that that person you're speaking to went to in their own work. If they've just written a book, and books plumb our depths and um, document our peaks. Okay, some grand blurb speak nonsense like this, but they've struggled and they've gone deep within themselves to produce whatever it is that they've just produced, and so there's a tacit assumption that you will join them in that depth. And so it's a nice way of cutting to the quick, so to speak, to get past too much of the niceties and actually get into like a deep and meaningful conversation with somebody that you haven't met before, which usually, and it happens in microcosm in interviews too, but it's necessary to establish some trust or rapport with somebody before they'll give you those gems, which only ever grow of great pressure at some like remove from the Earth's surface. Um, so that was something that I really benefited from in interviewing, is that people will just like they'll go deep with you, and you don't need to know them very well in order to join there. The other thing is that you can offer, which is it's an important component of community. I think to the extent that you can, to the extent that you're able, to the extent that you feel like it, when you offer something to someone, then they're more likely to join you in that as opposed to looking to take something from someone. And something that interviewing provides is attentive listening. Like I said earlier, I think that it's really one of the essential gifts that a human can offer another human, is to kind of put their ego aside for a moment and just say, like, my pores are open, my tentacles are up, and I'm ready to receive whatever it is you have to offer in response to what I've just offered you, a catalyst in your consciousness or something like this. um, and that listening is not only an act in that moment, but it's also an act that is um, that begins when one starts one's research for an interview. Like, um, something that I would routinely do, and which I continue to do as an interviewer, is to familiarize myself not only with the thing that most recently come out that the artist had produced, but literally to read every word that they've ever published, which would involve sometimes, reading people's dissertations. If I have to go back like 30 years into their history and really get a deep sense, a research process that would take maybe like 2 weeks or something, or sometimes longer, and not 9 to 5, not every day, but I feel like that acuity of attention and listening is a fine gift to offer someone. So yeah, it's always been enriching, um, to listen in a sustained way to anyone. And another component of that is that it's not just to artists that I've had the opportunity to listen at that depth, but I've just finished a manuscript of interviews about medical assistance in dying, for a book called Unspeakable, um, where again people have allowed for the joining at depth in experiences which are extremely personal and very often grief stricken, involving that legislation of 2015-16, um, regarding medical assistance in dying. I'd also like taken to interviewing my grandmother's fellow retirement home residents, her contemporaries, for 45 minutes or an hour at a time, and we would record the conversations on Zoom, like similar to what we're doing now. And then I just asked them, like, a list of 10 or 12 questions. Where were you born? What happened next? And they'll in when you do away with whatever it is, whatever kinds of conventions exist to prohibit our being able to share with one another deeply in conversation, people will just give you the whole world. If they can tell that you're listening attentively, they will give you themselves. And so, like, yeah, some kind of facilitated verbal portraiture ensues. And yeah, it's always very enriching. Like, listening is like 9/10 of the whole thing, I think. Maybe more.
No, yeah, that's definitely something I can relate to because I've kind of realized even just through the 3 episodes of this I've done like a bit of interviewing before, but yeah, you kind of start off with this like checklist of like, oh, everything you want to bring up, like all the questions you want to ask, but then as the conversation goes, you kind of just think of like new questions out of what people said, and it just, yeah, it really flows well like that, just like you said.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, there's like a speaking of theater earlier, there's an improvisational quality to it in that you prepare questions, you prepare a script, and then in the moment that something comes through, you have to be attentive to whatever it is that comes through. And often the follow-up questions and pursuing something that somebody's mentioned that interests you, that genuinely interests you, you're motivated by your own curiosity to ask the next question. And then they'll offer you something that's more interesting than you would have anticipated. Anyway, I'll stop there because yes, we
Yeah.
have a similar experience of this. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess from there, I will now go against that and do an awkward segue to Astoria Pictures, which you are the founder and president of. I just want to know what the process was behind creating Astoria Pictures and what it's been like so far.
So I'd say, like, one can claim to have founded just about anything that one is able to, I don't know, incorporate. Is that the key to founding a thing? Or maybe you just like arrive at Plymouth Rock and be like, I found it. So there's an illusory component to this idea of like founding a thing. That a corporation is like a corporation. This is the word body. What is this? We've just made a body out of thin air. This is a very strange concept in corporations. Um, and then let's not even get into like the Citizens United conversation where corporations are allotted as many, or in some cases, actually more rights than human beings. Very bizarre. Anyway, to the extent that I wanted a thing. Um, so I, yeah, incorporated with the name Astoria Pictures Inc. This company, which is basically a one-person operation, although I work with people on contract. Um, and I'm not sure that I really closely interrogated what it was that I was doing when I did such a thing as that. Um, but my goal was and remains to write and direct and produce and act in film. So far, I've only done the directing bit, but I'm in the process of adapting excerpts from the poetry debut, "The Correct Fury of Your Why is a Mountain," that you mentioned, and we'll see whether I can't end up in front of the camera at some point. We'll see. Um, so, uh, and I also wanted, and it might just be again that sort of megalomaniacal part of my psyche, which wants to have creative control over a process, and it's not just for my own self-interest, but actually to ensure things like equitable profit distribution. So, you know, when you start something, you can kind of make the rules because it doesn't exist and the rules have no consequence. And one of the sets of rules that I've set for myself for this company is to ensure that not only are people paid more than living wage, because I feel like this living wage business is like quite suspect, and minimum wage is like a grotesque parody of what one actually needs in order to live and eat food that is actually food and not just processed nonsense. Nevertheless, in addition to providing a living wage, one of the commitments that I make to the people that I work with is that they will receive a percentage of the profits, which is proportional to their labor and contribution. So a cinematographer might receive 3%, an actor or a supporting actor might receive 1%. This isn't like a profound novel idea. And at this stage in the game, it's not like those checks are going to be a very much. In fact, I haven't set out the first like round of checks because this like the film that I've made through Astoria Pictures, literally the first version of it, the English version as opposed to also the French version, has just come out 3 days ago. And I'm not sure how much has come in as a result of that because there's like a 1 week lag for the first payment to be processed. So I actually don't even know how much it's made so far. It did coincide with the Oppenheimer and Barbie release, and my timing wasn't probably great on that. Hopefully, we're working on a bit of a sleeper hit here. But nevertheless, those checks early on are not going to be very big. I can ensure that people are paid well upfront, and then I'll provide them with a percentage of the profits. And that's a commitment that I couldn't make if I like didn't, so to speak, like own the company. I can ensure how business is done, and that's one of the things that I can insist on. Um, I'm also mentally responsible for like the hiring and firing. And again, that might just be like an ego trip, but I just want to make sure that everybody's in a safe and comfortable environment, and that there's not, to the extent that I can avoid it, which is why I provide myself not just with the title of president, which is a formality, but like doofus in chief. There's no like real hierarchy. Like I'm not sitting at the apex of a pyramid and then everybody else around me is supposed to like execute whatever my divine revelation is. Like nonsense. We come together as collaborators, and everybody's job is of equal importance and value. And there are those who spend more time, and there are those who spend less time on a production. But everybody's voice is um, yeah, I don't know, has value, has dignity unto itself. And when you provide people, to the extent that I've been able to provide people through that work and then other work that I've done with the breadth of the freedom of their own creative voice, they tend to bring vastly more interesting and more nuanced and more subtle and more meaningful work than if I had just said, okay, like I'm thinking I feel kind of like a blue, purpley blue. Can you do like a purpley blue for me? And they'll just be like, okay, here's my. But they could offer something that's really interesting, which is like a kind of lime green, and you're completely oblivious to it. So yeah, I'm starting to ramble a little bit, but um, um, it's kind of like I had to invent a house which doesn't actually exist, so that I could like invite people over and we could like make pillow forts or something like this. Um, and I could insist on profit distribution um, and then I don't know if there's like a bit of associated cachet if I was to introduce myself as not just a person but then also like a person what invented a thing. And I can work as a producer to see whether I couldn't help to get adapted to the screen books that I really believe in. And so one of the things that I've done in my capacity as doofus in chief with Astoria Pictures is to come to represent a couple of Canadian presses, independent presses, one called Palimpsest Press and one called Gordon Hill Press, insofar as I'm helping them to prepare pitches, which is to say, like, distilled versions of what books that they produced are, so that I could approach producers to say, what do you think about this? Like, this might match up with what you're doing, and I think that this would be really funny, or like this has like a local spin on it that I think might like nicely connect with some of the work that you've done lately. Um, and maybe there's a certain added credibility if I'm like the something of someplace as opposed to just like any doofus with a name. So it's fundamentally a fiction. Corporation's a fiction, and but even things that are invented can have utility. And yeah, I've tried to list a couple of the ways in which it has utility in the world. Um, the question, like the prequel to that answer, would partly be like, I started making films, and again, I was working with, somebody mentioned, what about the possibility of interpreting poetry through dance? So I approached a couple of dancers. Well, why don't we film this rather than just have like a one-time thing? Found a cinematographer, Nicole Conan, with whom I worked on this film that's just come out a few days ago, since its beginning, maybe 5 years ago. And we just like filmed these interpretations of poems. Um, and I realized that film is just a medium that I am interested in because it synthesizes all of the mediums that I've been interested in to this point, and it can be a really powerful and easily circulated. It's also potentially profitable in a way that like poetry and some of the other arts just are not. And you know, suspicious though I might be of, okay, I won't get into the Marxist diatribe, but this is a roundabout way of my answering your questions. I hope you're starting to get used to the like nonsense that I'll offer into empty space if I'm provided with a container for it. Carry on.
Yeah, no. So you kind of mentioned giving other presses, I guess, a way into film through your Astoria Pictures, and your recent one that you released, Movements, was, I believe, based on a chapbook from Rose Garden Press, if I'm getting that correctly. So I just kind of wanted to get more into that film itself and what the kind of creative process was like for that.
Totally. So I'd mentioned Poetry London earlier, this poetry reading series. Um, Through that, I found a few poems from Canadian poets that I was just kind of crazy about, was really impressed by, and they captivated me and they were interesting. And I wanted to read in some way. And so, well, what about if we were to, in some way, stage a performance that involved interpreting those poems through movement, like kineticizing those poems? And then found out that there were like some incredible interpretive improvisational dancers in town, Nikki Carr and Ruth Doothright, like really formidable. I mean, um, like improvisational dance is like simultaneous composition and performance. In a way, it's like the essence of what art. Okay, I just had a third person perspective on what I was saying. I'm talking about the essence of art, but really, like composition and performance simultaneously is the shit. Like musicians who riff and improvise know what I'm talking about. Actors, comedians who improvise and riff know what I'm talking about. So anyway, formidable artists, Nikki Carr, Ruth Doothright, and they're open to it. Like, let's try this. And these poems are interesting. And then I'll talk them through the poems, be like, okay, so see what they're doing with this, like enjambment, this line break here. When this line comes to an end and then the next one happens, there's a suggestion maybe of this. Like, what do you think of that? And talking about the metaphor that evolves throughout the text, and okay, here's the turn and how can we render this turn um like kinetically, bodily, and they're into it. They're like, this is great. And as I say, rather than perform it as a sort of, I think we were originally going to perform it as part of something called Nuit Violette, which was like uh the University of Western Ontario's um uh sort of remodeling of, or reiteration of Nui. And it turned out that we were just kind of like pointed to a spot on a concrete beach where no one was around. And we're just like, okay, you can just perform there. Like, the ingredients here are really good. Let's not squander them on a nothing. Nothing's cool. I love theater in the moment. Beautiful, fantastic. But let's try this on film. And so maybe there's a local filmmaker. Maybe he could, Nicole Conan ends up, being willing to participate in this. And we shoot the first four of 13 of the movement's poems uh, in one day, one afternoon, over the course of about 3 hours. And it was the first time that I'd like directed. Like, if Nikki or Ruth or Nicole were listening to this right now, they would have smiled when I'd said directed, because I wasn't like standing there with like a, Okay, and now can we yeah, in this way, and it's a little to the left, and can we close the curtain? It's a little bit too much. No, no, no. It was like something's happening here, and I'm gonna keep my mouth shut for the most part and kind of observe because this is fantastic. And they had worked together before. There's like a really kind of fluid, dynamic, engaging cinematographic process that Nicole was involved in. There's a lot of trust already established between Nikki and Ruth, profound between the two of them, and then also with Nicole. And so they were able to interpret these texts really interestingly. And then I had a little bit of editorial input, but for the most part, Nikki or Nicole just like cut the footage in a very powerful way. And we had audio recordings from the poets themselves who had read the poems, and then we just like overlaid that as the audio to the videos. And then we had these like poetry films, I don't know, 7 minutes of material or something, or 6 minutes or something like this. Okay, that's interesting. Let's do more of that. Nicole's down. Nikki's up for it. Ruth, you likewise. Okay, fantastic. So as I start to become familiar with the arts councils, I apply for a bit of funding to do this. You know, like I don't know, $2,700 or $4,200 or something like this, and reach out to the London Arts Council, apply for funding. I had a little bit of experience doing that, organizing events, and we get a bit of money. Okay, fantastic. We'll shoot another few of these. So now I have to come up with a couple of more poems. No problem. You know, I'm saturated in contemporary poetry. It's easy enough to find poems that I really respond to, and I'm willing to invest that kind of energy to adapt. Um, End of the day, 13 different poems from 13 different poets are so chosen and adapted in a manner that is increasingly sort of dramatic, which follows my own, I guess, directorial development, but also deepening interest in theater and study of film to the extent that I studied film and theater. I included in my bio that I'd studied in Stratford, Ontario and Stratford upon Avon, but both like for less than two, like it was like less than, I don't know, it was like 5 days in Stratford upon Avon, like 2 weeks in Stratford, Ontario. It wasn't a thorough going, but I did meet a couple of interesting people and had some interesting experiences while I was there. Nevertheless, as my interest in film and theater became more serious, which is kind of tracked throughout the trajectory of the making of these films, which it took about 5 years to make 13 of them, like working occasionally. Okay, we can find a week here, a couple of days here. Nicole moves to BC. Okay, we'll shoot in BC for this weekend, this sort of thing. Cobbles it together. The 13 poems are put together, and I approach Rose Garden Press, run by Michelle Vanderwall and Michelle Arnett. Um, and they're open to publishing the 13 poems as an anthology, which would accompany the release of this film called Movements. Movements derived from the fact that I'd worked with dancers originally to interpret these poems. As I say, they became more dramatic and started intentionally casting actors, and then the locations became a little bit more um, dynamic, and we could include multiple locations and interpretations rather than just staying in one. So Michelle and Michelle are both open to publishing this chapbook anthology with Rose Garden Press, which is available now from their website, rosegardenpress.ca. They've done a really beautiful job with like a letterpress cover, which is embedded with wildflower seeds so that you could actually like bury the chapbook and then wildflowers would grow where you buried it. Seed paper provided by a company called Greenfield Paper Company in California. And not only were the poems printed in the original English, but then this fantastic translator called Sophie Lebois translated them into French. And then someone called Debbie Parliament facilitated their being translated into both ASL, American Sign Language, and LSQ, Langue de Signes du Québec, which is kind of, as I understand it, combination of ASL and French Sign Language, but which I'm sure has all sorts of like idiosyncratic and dialectal peculiarities or particularities about it. So now this anthology is like 4 languages. It has English, French, English on one side of the page, French on the other side, and then at the front of the book, like the front matter, there are QR codes which link to videos of the ASL and LSQ interpretation. So it's like a 4 language anthology, um, which accompanies this 25, 27 minute long film version of 13 poems from 13 poets across this country called Canada. So yeah, that's how that happened.
That's really cool though, how yeah, like filmmaking, poetry, and both like a visual and a written form are coming together for that. And like you said with the QR codes for ASL, like that's just something you I guess couldn't have done years prior, like with when the internet was kind of in its more I don't want to say fetal stage, but yeah.
For sure. No, Fetal's great. Absolutely. Yeah. I was just going to say the QR codes became kind of ubiquitous during the pandemic. If somebody was go to a restaurant, instead of being able to handle a menu, they'd be able to use a QR code. It also presumes, though, that one would have access to a smartphone, which of course everybody doesn't have. We tried to curb that presumption of privilege by including the URL, the website itself. Nevertheless, yeah. Oh, also, I should say that there are 2 other QR codes within the chapbook, one to the French audiobook version and another to the English audiobook version. Okay, that's enough for me. Sorry, go ahead.
That's awesome. It's like a one-stop shop. It's amazing.
And you can bury it, which is the best part as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, hopefully, they like it enough where they don't feel the need to bury it, but
Or maybe they like it enough that they want to bury it. You know what I mean?
that too, because then they can always watch the movie.
There you go.
Yeah, so I guess from there I wanted to get into what's next for Astoria Pictures and yourself as well.
Well, how much time do you have? No, I'm just kidding. So I would say, um, so my first priority is that I've got to finish cutting the French version of the film and then re-subtitling it with French captions. That'll all be done within the next week, 2 weeks, maybe. And then I'm in the process of developing 6 pitches for the 2 presses that I'd mentioned earlier, Palimpsest Press, 3 titles from Palimpsest, 3 titles from Gordon Hill Press, in anticipation of an event called IP Market Day, formerly Page to Screen, that is a collaboration between the Toronto International Film Festival and Ontario Creates. That'll happen in September the 13th, I think, in Toronto. So we'll pitch before a room of producers and journalists, slipping into my Aussie accent, which I've been counseled by the number of Australians that I've encountered here isn't all that Australian. It turns out that the accent I've liked to do back in Canada, they don't travel, because when you encounter people who are of the place whose accent you're affecting, they're like, yeah, that doesn't sound even like a little bit New Zealand, but maybe not Australian. Anyway, where did that come from? And then I'm in the like when I left for Serbia in April, I also gave up my apartment in London, Ontario, in anticipation of my moving to Montreal. And so I'm going to move there, and so therefore will this invisible, non-existent house that I've made called Astoria Pictures travel. So relocated in Montreal. I've got a little bit of coin thanks to the London Arts Council, and hopefully in the future a little more coin from the Ontario Arts Council and the Canada Council for the Arts to adapt excerpts of my debut poetry collection, The Correct Fury of Your Wise Mountain, in a manner similar to the way in which I had helped to interpret the poems comprising the Movements anthology. And then I'm reluctant to talk too much more about other things that I have planned, because plans are like delusional. I think John Lennon said something like "Life is what happens when you're planning for it," or something like that. I, I will come out with this book of interviews about medical assistance in dying, which is a subject that's been important for me over the last couple of years. And I have the intention at this moment to adapt that book, which I expect will come out in 2025, if all goes well, into a documentary. And what I've been telling myself is that I'd be convening panels at maybe I don't know, 6-city tour across the country, releasing the book, panels of experts, not just with professional or formal expertise, but with like experiential expertise that they'd experienced made in some way, a family member who received it, or if they wanted to undergo it themselves, they needed an adjustment to the legislation. In some way, people who had some significant relationship with the question of MAID, and then film those launches, and then cut that with whatever else the documentary would entail. It's still in like a fetal stage, to echo your phrase from earlier. And then after that, I have ambitions. But I won't articulate the ambitions because I would just be a guy articulating ambitions. Yeah.
All right. And so for the last part of the show here, I like to do 5 rapid fire questions. They should be pretty simple, so you can just we can just rifle them off one at a time here. Are you ready for those?
Okay, let's go.
Okay. So, question 1. Biggest poetic inspiration, whether that's a specific poet or a poem.
Or this breath. That's what came to mind. This breath. Instant means to breathe. Inspirare from the Latin. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but just every breath. Oh my God, every breath. This breath, but particularly this breath.
Alrighty.
That's the best you're gonna get out of
me. That was an amazing answer right there. I was captivated. Yeah, so number 2, personal favorite piece that you yourself have written.
Okay, the first thought that came to mind was a poem called Human Beings Met to Suture the Wounds the Railroads Have Made Across This Country. And I think the reason that it came to mind was it was the first instance of my having written something that I felt like I had envisioned in the writing. And like in the backyard of my mom's place and formerly my dad's place on Astoria Court, which is where I get the name Astoria Pictures. Like there was this particular scene, people sitting around a campfire that I'd envisioned, like twilight, stars, tattered clouds overhead. And I'd envisioned it like with great detail and rendered it in the poem. And then I was reading it from the book, and I just saw the same faces illuminated by the fire in the same backyard that I envisioned. And I was like, holy shit, this is some kind of magic. Like I have just conjured this thing into existence. And and in the midst of a performance too, I was like kind of, yeah, it felt like a dream. It felt like a dream. So maybe that poem for now, but also I should say something elusive, like the next poem. That's what I'm supposed to say.
Ooh. Okay, I'm gonna jump more to the filmmaking side here. Favorite movie?
This favorite business is a preoccupation of some kind of contingent individualism and circumstance fetishism, which I completely refute and deny, standing on my Buddhistic nonsense as I must. I read recently as a funny line, when I was a Buddhist, I was insufferable to my family members, but then I became a Buddha and everything was fine. Anyway, I tout a little bit too loudly my own Buddhistic influences. Anyway, favorite movie? Jesus, man. Favorite movie? Like 3 movies that came to the 3 movies that came to mind. The first one is Forrest Gump because I watched that a whole bunch when I was a kid at my grandparents' cottage in Kettle Point. Kettle Point. And the next one was The Wizard of Oz, which isn't one of my favorite movies, but it just came to mind. So, in the interest of my being transparent and prismatic, there's the answer to that. And then the third one was Schindler's List. Likewise, not something that I think of as my favorite movie, but it just came to mind. So, I claim no favoritism in relation to any of those three titles. Something I liked that I saw rewatched recently, was called the Meyerowitz Stories, New and Selected, which was written by Noah Baumbach, and it's a performance of like the scene that I'm thinking of particularly is Ben Stiller and Adam Sandler, and they like go onto an elevator at a hospital, and they go down the elevator, and they walk off the elevator, and the nature of the dialogue in that conversation, it's like, Baumbach. Hats off to Baumbach in that one. Okay, rapid answers, Kevin. Let's go.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna avoid the word favorite for this next one. Is there a book you are enjoying reading at the moment?
I mean, there's like a stack that I'm working with to write poems through. And part of that stack is a trilogy of books about Malta, which is where my hosts here at the Bratza Artist Residency in Châteauneuf-sur-Charente spent much time. And to the extent that I've dipped into that in order to write these poems, that's been really interesting. Uh, yeah, I'll just mention that it's yeah.
All right, all
Everything's
right.
captivating though. Like everything's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. And the last question here, this one might require a little bit longer of an answer now that I think about it. But what would the biggest piece of advice be that you would give for young artists, just in
Oh.
general?
Okay, so yeah, I'm just gonna allow myself a little bit longer answer here. So, I spent some time at a monastery last year, and I asked something similar to the senior most monk who was offering a Dharma talk, after evening meditation. I was like, "What is the artist's responsibility in society?" And his response was, like you have to get rid of this idea that you're an artist. Like, what is that art? Like, what is this artist nonsense? So first of all, suspicion of nouns. This is a piece of advice that's genuine. Like I think there are assumptions embedded within the language that we use. Any language that you use has assumptions embedded within it. And one of the assumptions that's rife throughout the English language is the solidity of nouns and of identities. Those don't, as far as I'm concerned, match up with reality, which is constantly permutating and in flux and changing as we are. Um, and any identity that you affix to yourself might feel like cozy, but it's a cage, and we are not meant for cages. So don't put too much emphasis in your own self-conception on any one noun, whether that is like artist or any other vocation or any like component of your psyche or your experience. I just discourage generally any fixation, like any noun fixation. Um, we are verbs until we die, and then we become nouns if we're lucky, says Robert Haas. I like this line. Okay, other advice: never listen to advice from anyone. You are God incarnate. You are the Buddha. You are all of the prophets combined and doubled. You are Mother Magdalene. You are Mother Earth. You are the cosmos incarnate. No one knows more than you. Your intuition is like the gods, nature speaking through you. And so if you encounter anyone who you presume possesses a level of authority which you don't yourself possess, you're delusional. Like there is no such thing as hierarchy. That's like a Western fixation. Um, and just be true to whatever your intuition says, because your intuition is right. Authority is like an accretive social convention, which is to be what one is to be wary of. Um, so nobody knows any better than you do. And if what I'm saying now doesn't resonate, then stop listening or continue to listen, but just do so with a grain of salt in your ear if that's not too uncomfortable. Other advice, yeah, getting back to the imposter syndrome thing, like you are worthy, you are fully worthy. Every atom of your being, every thought that you've ever been, well, I'd like to say deluded by, but which has passed through your consciousness. Every, I don't know, meal you've ever eaten, every meal you've yet to eat, every heartbeat that you've yet to undertake uh, is worthy, is fully worthy. And no one is more due the attention or the stage or the merit of sharing whatever it is that's going on inside you. Like your expression is valid and valuable. And if you can figure out a way in which to balance the offering of that expression, which also countenances other people's need to share what they have to offer, which is to say, listening. And if ideally you can find a ratio of listening in greater proportion to expressing, that might be my like bit of advice, then aspire to that. Um, Also, to the extent that you have access to it, if you're able to, um, I don't know, be mindful about what you put into your body, like uh, because our experiences are like accretions of what we put into our body in some ways. And that can be experience, that can be what you digest visually, that can be what you drink or what you eat or what you smoke or don't smoke. I'm not trying to like be a teetotaler or disavow the consumption of any kind of whatever substances, but just be mindful. That's all. Like be mindful while you're in the midst of it, if it's possible. Just be mindful. Um, and then appreciating again that all of this is to be taken with a grain of salt because I've already subverted my own authority by recognizing that it doesn't exist, nor does it exist in anyone else. Meditation for me, just for me, at least meditation. Like I think there are probably several billion people on the planet contemporaneous to this moment, but also historically, who have also gotten down with meditation. Not that widely practiced in the West, might be more widely practiced in the West. It's ubiquitous elsewhere. Meditation is something to consider. Um, it's something that I tried once when I was like in my late teens. I just like sat on a lounge chair. I just fell asleep. I'm like, this meditation thing's stupid. What the hell is that? I'm not going to do that. And then 10 years later or so, I kind of woke up to the possibility that it was a practice that I should begin. For me, that took the form of it's called like a Nichiren Buddhist practice, the repetition of a particular phrase, which is called Daimoku. The phrase is Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, which means I dedicate myself to the universal law of cause and effect through sound. The goal of producing that phrase over and over and over again at the same pitch and in that consistency, if you can find that consistency, like you'll begin to experience a certain balance and stability in your own thinking and consciousness, and you'll also externalize whatever instability or wavering in your own kind of being in consciousness you're experiencing. That wasn't all very clear, but if I had meditated for longer, it would have been more fluently expressed, I'm sure. Sitting and breathing. That's it. Like if you can just sit and breathe, forget about chants, forget about mantras, forget about religious affiliations or spirituality. We have bodies, they require oxygen. We have hearts, they require beating. And if you can combine your breath with awareness of your heartbeat, breathe in slowly through your nostrils and feel the coolness of the air as it passes by your nostrils. Feel your chest cavity expand as your lungs expand. And then maybe a little tension in your lips, pursing them as you're exhaling. It's all about the breath. All of meditation is just about the breath. And it doesn't induce a sense of calm, but it will make you aware of your own disquiet. And being aware of that disquiet can help you to reduce it. And I found nothing so central or important for my own artistic practice than meditation. It's the same process by which a glass of orange juice on a table will, if it's allowed to sit for long enough, become transparent. If it's allowed to sit for long enough, then the sort of sediment and the pulp and whatnot will slowly fall to the bottom. And to replicate that process of the sediment falling allows for like light to pass through, which I think of as inspiration, which is whatever it is that comes through when you feel the knocking at your door that a poem is, or that a painting is, or that a song is. Meditation, meditation, meditation. Finn.
Awesome. That was a very nuanced answer, and I think it's the perfect bookend to this conversation we've had today. Kevin, I just want to thank you for coming on this show for our third episode, and really we just covered such a range from your poetry to your filmmaking to meditation at the end, and just some great life advice in general beyond just art.
Anthony, as I mentioned, it's like one of the rare honors that one can confer to another person, this attentive listening that you've been practicing over the last hour and more. And so I'm very grateful for your having offered that. And I wish you the best is too trite or curt. May you be well. May you be free of suffering.
Well, thank you for that. And to everyone listening or watching at home, you're the best for making it this far. Stay tuned for another great episode next week, our final episode, in fact. But yeah, that's all for today's episode. As usual, peace.